You knew a Norton Commando, by the way, it didn't punish you. The deep, clean pull of the big twin through the gears, smooth where every other British bike shook your hands numb, the last machine a British rider could point to and call the best in the world. 5 years running, the country's riders voted it exactly that. Around 60,000 were built and sold across the globe. And this was a company that had survived everything. It survived going bankrupt in 1913. It survived the death of its founder, 2 world wars, and nearly 100,000 military machines built for the nation. It survived losing its Birmingham home and the collapse of the company that owned it. And then, after 80 years, Norton was gone. How does a marque that survived all of that, bankruptcy, 2 wars, the loss of everything, simply disappear? What really happened inside those walls? Chapter 1. Pa Norton's Bradford Street. The story of Britain's greatest superbike doesn't begin with a superbike. It begins with a sick man in a Birmingham workshop, filing small components by hand, dreaming of machines faster than he would ever be well enough to ride. His name was James Lansdowne Norton. He was born in Birmingham in 1869, and he served his apprenticeship in the jewellery trade. That most Birmingham of trades, all fine tolerances and small precious things made properly in the tight streets of the jewellery quarter, where a man was judged by the 1,000th of an inch. He carried its habits with him for the rest of his life. He was a devout man, Methodist to his bones, teetotal, the sort of craftsman who believed that doing a job badly was a small sin against the order of the world. The people who knew him remembered the standards before they remembered the man. And he was ill. In 1888, not yet 20, he'd caught rheumatic fever, and it never truly let go of him. It aged him, it greyed him, it weakened a heart that would trouble him to the end. By the time he had men working beneath him, they'd taken to calling him Pa, not for his years, but for the way he wore them. A young man in an old man's body, coughing through the Birmingham damp, going out to Switzerland and Italy in the winters, because his doctors told him the English cold would finish him. In 1898, he founded the Norton Manufacturing Company at number 320 Bradford Street, in the thick of the industrial city. He didn't start by building motorcycles. He built fittings and chains and parts for the 2-wheel trade, the small components other men bolted onto their own machines. It was steady, unglamorous work, and it paid the rent. But the bicycle was quietly becoming the motorcycle. The petrol engine was arriving on 2 wheels, and Pa Norton, who could feel it coming the way a craftsman feels the grain of a thing, meant to be there when it did. His first real machine came in 1902. He called it the Energette, and its heart was a little French single, a 143cc Clément engine brought into Britain through the agent Charles Garrard. It was modest, it was borrowed, and it revealed, right at the start, the pattern that would shadow the company for the next 80 years. Norton's genius was never quite matched by Norton's money, and so Norton learned from the beginning to make brilliance out of other men's engines. It was a habit born of necessity. In the end, it would become a habit that killed. Then came the moment that made the myth. In 1907, on the Isle of Man, they ran the first tourist trophy, the TT, the race that would become motorcycling's cathedral, a circuit of ordinary roads over a real mountain where the penalty for a mistake was absolute. A rider named Rem Fowler took a Peugeot-engined Norton into the twin-cylinder class. He suffered punctures, plug trouble, a spill, and he won it anyway, on average speed and sheer refusal to stop. The very first TT, and a Norton had its name on it. From that day forward, the marque possessed something no balance sheet could buy: a bloodline. Norton was a winner. Everyone said so. Everyone believed it. And belief, in this trade, was worth more than gold. The trouble was, winning races and running a business are 2 entirely different crafts, and Pa Norton had truly mastered only one of them. He was a superb engineer and a poor man of commerce, and in 1913, barely 15 years after he'd hung up his sign, the Norton Manufacturing Company went into liquidation. The greatest name in British racing was, quietly and without ceremony, broke. It was rescued by a man from the components trade. Bob Shelley of R.T. Shelley and Company stepped in and kept the concern alive. A family connection, as it happened, for Shelley was Pa Norton's brother-in-law. Shelley brought with him a tuner named Dan O'Donovan, known to everyone as Wizard O'Donovan, who took Norton's road engines out to the Brooklands track and turned them into record breakers. stamping the fastest of them with a name, the BRS, Brooklands Road Special, that customers would pay a premium to own. It was the records that kept the lights on. A man who could not afford to lose bought a Norton because a Norton had been proven on the concrete banking at Weybridge to be faster and to last longer than the thing his neighbour rode. The racing wasn't a hobby the company indulged. It was the whole commercial argument, the reason a small Birmingham firm could charge more than its rivals, and get it. Norton survived. Norton always survived. But note the year and hold on to it, because it matters more than any race result. 1913. From that point onward, Norton was almost never truly solvent. The greatness and the fragility were not two separate things that happened to share a factory. They were the same thing, wearing different faces. Pa Norton didn't live to see the best of it, nor the worst. His heart, worn thin since boyhood, gave out on the 21st of April, 1925. He was 56. They buried him at Lodge Hill Cemetery in Birmingham, a few miles from the workshop where it all began, and the trade mourned him as one of its own. He left behind a company that bore his name, kept his standards, and had already been bankrupt once, a company built, from its very foundation, on the beautiful and dangerous habit of reaching for more than it could quite afford. Chapter 2. The Featherbed Years. For a while, the reaching worked. For a while, it worked magnificently. Through the 1920s, Norton had settled into the home that would become its spiritual address, Bracebridge Street in Aston, a cramped, blackened, low-ceilinged works hemmed in by terraced houses, the sort of place that looked like nothing and produced miracles. There, the racing legend deepened. An engineer named Walter Moore designed an overhead camshaft engine in 1927 that gave Norton the weapon it needed. Then came the man who would define the company's competitive soul for a generation. Joe Craig, a hard, spare, obsessive Ulsterman who ran the race department as though the outcome of each season were a matter of personal honour. With the designer Arthur Carroll, and later the quietly brilliant Polish émigré engineer Leo Kosmicki, Craig refined an engine so fundamentally right that a version of it kept winning for the better part of 30 years. The men who worked for Craig said he could hear a tenth of a horsepower. They also said he was impossible to please, which in that trade was very nearly the same compliment, and win it did. Through the 1930s on the mountain course, Norton was very nearly untouchable. Jimmy Guthrie, Stanley Woods, name after name carved into the record books, at an average speed that climbed year on year. This was the age when a British boy could stand at the roadside on the Isle of Man in the thin northern sunshine, feel the ground shake as the singles came howling past, smell the hot oil and the castrol R on the breeze, and know in his bones that the best motorcycles in the world were built by men who spoke as he spoke, in cities whose names he could point to on a map. Then the war came, and Norton did what British industry did. It stopped racing and started serving. Across the Second World War, Bracebridge Street turned out close to 100,000 military motorcycles, chiefly the side-valve 16H and the big 16-4 machines, plain and tough and utterly without vanity. Dispatch riders carried them through the desert dust and the Normandy mud, through the long retreat and the longer advance. Nearly 1 in 4 of every military motorcycle Britain used was a Norton. For a whole generation of servicemen, Norton wasn't a name on a race result they'd read about. It was the machine that had been underneath them when it mattered, the thing that got the message through. And when those men came home, hundreds of thousands of them, demobbed and restless and hungry for a motorcycle of their own, they came home already trusting the name on the tank. Norton had spent the war building loyalty it could never have afforded to buy. That, too, was a kind of capital, the only kind the company ever seemed to have in abundance. And when peace returned, Norton produced the object that remains, to this day, its finest single gift to motorcycling. And it came not from Birmingham, but from Belfast. 2 brothers, Rex and Cromie McCandless, working with the rider Artie Bell, had been experimenting with frame design in a way nobody in the mainstream trade quite took seriously, chasing the thing every rider chased and few could describe, a motorcycle that went precisely where you pointed it and stayed there over bumps, at speed, under braking. In 1950, Norton adopted their creation. When the veteran test rider, Harold Danielle, climbed off an early example, he reached for the only words that fit. Riding it, he said, was like riding on a featherbed. The name stuck, because the name was true. The featherbed frame changed what a motorcycle could do. That same year, a young rider named Jeff Duke took a featherbed Norton to victory in the senior TT, breaking the lap record and the race record together, with Nortons filling the places right behind him, finishing 1, 2 and 3, and doing the same in the junior. Duke went on to take double world championships in 1951 and 1952 in the 350 and the 500cc classes both, and an OBE to go with them, and a fame that reached well beyond the enthusiast press. For a few golden seasons, Norton was not merely a British champion among others. It was the champion, full stop, the mark against which every rival measured itself and came up short. Underneath all this glory, something quieter had happened. In 1949, an engineer named Bert Hopwood had drawn up a new parallel twin engine for the road, the Model 7 Dominator, a clean, sensible, well-mannered thing meant to answer Triumph's popular twins. It was a good engine, a sound engine, designed with care. Nobody in that moment could have known that the very same engine, stretched and bored and pushed and coaxed far beyond anything Hopwood intended for it, would still be beating inside Norton's flagship motorcycle more than 20 years later. That it would, in the end, be asked to do the impossible, and would break trying. Because here, at the very summit of the featherbed years, sits the quiet warning the whole story turns upon. As early as 1953, Rex McCandless himself, the man whose frame had saved Norton on the track, was telling the factory a hard truth. The single-cylinder racer was finished. The future belonged to multi-cylinder machines, and Norton needed to fund a proper new one now, while it still led the world and had the credit to do it. The factory listened politely. And then it did nothing. It had learned, you see, the most seductive lesson available to a clever, underfunded company, that a brilliant frame could keep an old engine winning for years. That engineering genius could be spent postponing the reckoning rather than meeting it. It was a lesson that felt exactly like wisdom. It was, in truth, a slow-acting poison, and Norton had begun to drink it. Chapter 3. The Wreckage of AMC. The postponement had a price, and it arrived in the shape of an owner. In 1953, the very year McCandless was sounding his warning, Norton was sold to Associated Motorcycles, the London group that already owned the old names of AJS and Matchless. On paper, it looked like security, a bigger parent, deeper pockets, a place in a larger family. In practice, it was the beginning of the end of Norton as master of its own house. For a while, the racing carried on and the Bracebridge Street works kept its old rhythm. But in 1962 and 63, AMC closed it. The Birmingham home of Norton, the address that meant Norton, the cramped works where the featherbed and 30 years of TT victories had been born, shut its gates. Its final workforce, some 160 souls, was scattered, and production was carted south to AMC's plant at Plumstead, in southeast London. Norton was no longer a Birmingham mark, a Midlands thing, one of the city's 1,000 trades. It had become a line entry on another company's ledger, and that other company was dying. AMC's numbers tell the story with the flat cruelty peculiar to an account book. In 1960, it had turned a modest profit, £219,000. The following year, that figure inverted into a loss of £350,000. The decline gathered its own momentum, the way declines do, one bad year lending weight to the next. And in August 1966, Associated Motorcycles collapsed into the hands of the official receiver. The proud old names, Norton chief among them, were suddenly assets in a bankruptcy, inventory waiting to be picked over by whoever had the nerve and the cash. Enter the man who would, in time, gamble everything. His name was Dennis Poor, Roger Dennistoun Poor, to give it its full formal weight. And he was not a motorcycle man in the way Pa Norton had been a motorcycle man. He was a financier, a tall, clever, patrician figure, a former Grand Prix and hill climb racer who'd driven a supercharged Alfa Romeo up British hills faster than almost anyone, a founder of the magazine Autosport and, crucially, the chairman of Manganese Bronze Holdings, a company that had already absorbed the great engine maker Villiers in 1965. Poor understood assets. He understood how a name carried value long after the factory behind it had begun to fail. When AMC fell, he moved. He gathered the wreckage from the receiver and welded it into a new concern, Norton Villiers. He had bought himself a legendary name, a tired factory, and a problem that no quantity of financial cleverness could dissolve. The problem was simple to state and very nearly impossible to answer. Norton Villiers had no genuinely modern motorcycle to sell. The range it inherited was old, and the world was moving. And so, in his Kensington office in the closing weeks of 1966, Poor gathered his engineers around him and asked the question that would give birth to the Commando. "So," he said, "what are we going to make?" There was a deadline welded to the question, and it was merciless. The Earl's Court Motorcycle Show in November 1967. Under a year away. A new flagship on that stand, or there would be nothing to sell and no company to sell it. It was, on the face of it, an absurd thing to demand. New motorcycles took years to design, test and tool for production, and everyone in that office knew it. But Poor was not really asking for a new motorcycle in the honest sense of the phrase. He was asking for the appearance of one, something fresh enough, striking enough, modern enough to fill the Norton stand and reassure the dealers and keep the orders coming while the money lasted. He was a financier playing for time, and time was the one commodity he could not manufacture. The deadline was not cruelty. It was arithmetic. Wages had to be paid, and they had to be paid from sales, and there would be no sales without something to show at Earl's Court in November. The men he'd assembled to answer him were not fools. Quite the opposite. Poor had recruited seriously, and with an eye for pedigree. There was Dr. Stephen Bauer, a rigorous, principled engineer poached from Rolls-Royce, a man accustomed to the unforgiving disciplines of aerospace, who looked at motorcycle design with an outsider's cold and useful eye. There was Bernard Hooper and Bob Trigg, both gifted, and a young engineer named John Faville, and Tony Dennis. There was Charles Udall, brought over from Plumstead, whose complex twin camshaft prototype, a machine known internally as the P10, had been meant to be the company's future, and had instead become a leaking, troublesome, unaffordable dead end. Everyone in the room knew the P10 wasn't ready. Everyone knew there was no money to make it ready, and no time on the calendar to design a clean replacement from a blank sheet, which meant they all understood the terrible arithmetic from that very first meeting. Whatever they conjured for Earl's Court, it would have to be built around the engine they already possessed, Burt Hopwood's parallel twin, by now grown to a full 745cc, and by now very nearly 20 years old. There would be no new engine. There was no money for a new engine. The most important British motorcycle of its entire generation would have to be summoned out of an obsolete one, on borrowed time, by clever and honest men who understood, better than anyone, exactly how deep the trouble ran. They took the job anyway. What else, in that room, in that autumn, was there to do? Chapter 4. 11 weeks. So they performed a miracle. It's the kindest word, and it also happens to be the truest. Bob Trigg would later describe the moment with the plainness of a man recalling something that still astonished him years afterward. The team, he said, were told the company would go bust without a new bike at Earl's Court, and they could not have a new engine. They'd have to use the old Atlas twin for want of time and money. That was the entire brief. Save the company. Here is an engine everyone agrees is finished. Here are roughly 11 weeks. Begin. The problem with the old twin was never its power. It was its violence. The parallel twin layout, in which both pistons rise and fall together in unison, shakes by its very nature, and this particular engine, a design traceable back to the 1930s and stretched over the decades from a mild 500cc to a muscular 750, shook hard. It buzzed at the bars until a rider's fingers tingled and then went numb. It blurred the mirrors into uselessness. It cracked brackets, fractured mudguards, and walked its own bolts loose over a long day's riding. By 1967, that vibration was no longer something a salesman could dress up as British character. It was a defect, plainly, and everyone in the trade knew it, and the Japanese machines just beginning to appear did not have it. Dr. Bauer, the Rolls-Royce man, began by committing a small and necessary heresy. He looked at the sacred featherbed frame, the frame that had made Norton's name, the frame that riders and journalists spoke of in the hushed tones reserved for relics, and he judged it, by the cold engineering principles he'd carried out of aerospace, to be simply wrong. Not stiff enough, not rational. Beautiful, perhaps, but not correct. So he set it aside, that holy object, and designed instead a simpler, far stiffer frame built around a single large backbone tube, 2¼ inches across. It took a certain nerve to bin the thing everybody worshipped. It was also, on its own, nowhere near enough, because a stiff frame bolted rigidly to a shaking engine does not cure the shaking. It transmits it more faithfully than ever. The answer, the true stroke of genius, the idea that turned a desperate stopgap into a legend, came from Hooper and Trigg, and it was the kind of idea that seems obvious only after someone brave has had it. Rather than fighting to stop the engine vibrating, they decided to stop the vibration from ever reaching the rider. They bolted the engine, the gearbox and the swinging arm together into a single rigid unit, and then they isolated that whole assembly from the frame with a set of carefully engineered rubber mountings. The powertrain was set free to shake as violently as it pleased, buzzing away inside its rubber cocoon, while the frame, and with it the handlebars, the footrests, the seat and the rider's own hands, floated serenely clear of the storm. They named the system Isolastic. Hooper and Trigg filed the patent as joint inventors on the 8th of June 1967, with the show now only months away. It ought not to have worked half so well as it did. It worked beautifully. The effect, to any rider raised on British twins, was close to uncanny. The deep, muscular, torquey shove of a big engine delivered with almost none of the punishment that had always been the price of it. And Poor, who grasped that a new motorcycle must look new as surely as it must feel new, insisted that the engine be canted forward in the frame, tilting the whole machine into a posture of forward motion, even as it stood still on its stand. He brought in the fashionable London design consultancy, Wolff Olins, to shape a striking one-piece fiberglass tail, the Fastback, and to find a name with a hard, confident, faintly military edge to it. Not the Dominator, not the Atlas, the Commando. It launched at Earl's Court in November 1967, dead on the impossible deadline, and the crowds pressed three deep around the stand. The press, expecting the tired old Atlas in new clothes, found instead a motorcycle that looked like the future and, when they finally got to ride it the following year, felt like it too. The word that came up again and again in the road tests was the one word Norton most needed to hear: smooth. A big British twin that a man could hold at speed for an hour without his hands turning to wood. The journalists could scarcely believe it, and neither, quite, could Norton. The first production machines followed in April 1968, priced at around £475. There were teething troubles, and Norton met them with reasonable honesty. The earliest frames flexed and had to be redesigned by January 1969. The drive chain jumped its sprockets under hard acceleration, until the engineers cured it by hanging the swinging arm from the engine plates rather than the frame itself. These were the ordinary growing pains of a machine built at a sprint. They were fixed, and the fixes held. And here is the ache folded quietly inside the Triumph. The single most important British motorcycle of its era, the machine that would carry the whole industry's pride and much of its self-respect into the 1970s, had been engineered in something like 11 weeks. Around an engine not one man in that Kensington room had wanted to keep. It was a magnificent house, raised at breakneck speed and with genuine love, upon foundations that everyone involved knew perfectly well were borrowed. And it stood. For a glorious few years, it did far more than stand. It ruled. Chapter 5. Machine of the Year. It didn't merely sell, it reigned. Every year, the readers of Motorcycle News, the working riders, the men with oil under their fingernails and real opinions earned in real weather, voted for their Machine of the Year. And every year, from 1968 straight through to 1972, they gave the crown to the Norton Commando. 5 wins, 5 years running, no single lucky season, no flash in the pan, but a sustained and repeated coronation by the very people who knew motorcycles best, choosing the Commando again and again and again and again and again. In the whole long history of British motorcycling, there is no prouder run than that one. It has never been equalled. And it happened, remember, while the industry all around it was already beginning to buckle, while famous old names were folding, while showrooms filled up with Japanese machines, while the writing went up on the wall for anyone willing to read it. Norton was winning its readers' hearts in the very years the ground was opening beneath the whole trade. The crown was real, the kingdom was already crumbling, and the range bloomed to meet the acclaim. The original Fastback was joined by the R and the S. The S, with its exhaust pipes swept up high on the left flank, aimed squarely and unashamedly at the American market that Norton needed to conquer. Then came the Roadster in 1970, Low and clean and, to many eyes, the definitive shape of the thing. Then the High Rider in 1971, with its high-rise handlebars and stepped seat, chasing the chopper fashion that the film Easy Rider had loosed upon a generation. There was a street scrambler and a long-range fastback for touring, and, from 1972, the Interstate, with a great broad tank built for swallowing motorways whole. There was a road racing production racer, developed with the racer Peter Inchley, and painted a fierce, unmissable yellow that the paddock swiftly christened the Yellow Peril. There was even the Interpol, the police model, shaped by the old Norton hand Neil Shilton, and sold to constabularies up and down the land. Picture the Commando in its pomp, the forward-canted engine, all intent and muscle, the deep, unhurried thunder of the big twin pulling cleanly and endlessly through the gears, a sound with weight to it, a sound you felt in your chest, and above everything else, the smoothness, that impossible, patented smoothness that Norton marketed under the name Glide Ride, delivered on the one machine in Britain where every direct rival still buzzed a rider's palms into numbness within 20 miles. This was the sensation Norton sold, and, rarest of things in that trade, it was entirely real. A large, fast, hairy-chested British motorcycle that finally, after all those decades, didn't punish a man for riding it hard. It was the last machine on earth about which a British rider could lean against a bar, fold his arms, and say with a perfectly straight face, "Ours is still the best in the world." Behind the gleaming icon, though, lay the scattered and slightly anxious geography of a company that had never in its life had quite enough money. The Plumstead Works in London, where Norton had washed up after the loss of Birmingham, was itself shut in July 1969, swept away under a Greater London Council compulsory purchase order. Assembly moved out to a new plant at Northway in Andover, in Hampshire, drawn there by a government subsidy for a designated development area. The test department made do in a drafty hangar at the old Thruxton airfield nearby, and the engines and gearboxes were built up separately at the former Villiers Works, right back in the industrial Midlands at Wolverhampton, from which some 80 complete machines emerged each week. It was not, if you troubled to look closely, the serene operation of a company in full command of its destiny. It was a national legend held together across 3 sites and several hundred miles of English road by the skill, the pride, and the sheer bloody stubbornness of the people who built it. The advertising caught the whole mood exactly. Norton fronted its campaigns with a model named Vivian Neves, the Norton Girl, and the machine slid effortlessly into shorthand for a particular kind of British cool, the two-wheeled equivalent of everything the country still fervently believed it did better than anyone alive. For a few bright years around the turn of the decade, if you wished to signal that you possessed taste and nerve and a real feeling for engineering, you rode a Commando. Around 60,000 of them would eventually be built and sold across the world. At its very height, the Commando wasn't simply a motorcycle you could buy, it was a flag you could fly. But hold that image of the summit a moment longer, because the light falling on it is already, quietly, beginning to change. Fold into all that justified pride a single cold fact, a fact the men at Norton knew perfectly well, and worked very hard indeed not to dwell upon. At the precise moment, the Commando was first being crowned Machine of the Year, in 1968, with the marque riding higher than it had in a decade. The machine that would one day bury the entire British motorcycle industry was already designed, already unveiled, already sitting in showrooms and taking orders. It had 4 cylinders, where the Commando had 2. It had a disc brake at the front, when the Commando still had drums. It started at the push of a button, on a cold morning. First time, every time, without the ritual of tickling carburetors and swinging on a kickstart and praying. It did not leak oil onto the garage floor. It did not vibrate. It undercut the British machines on price, and it simply refused to break. It came from Japan, from a company called Honda, and it was called the CB750. Norton had spent 11 weeks and every ounce of its ingenuity taming the vibration of a 20-year-old twin, and while it celebrated, a rival on the far side of the world had quietly rendered the entire problem obsolete. Norton's eventual answer to that machine, when at last the answer came, would not turn out to be the thing that saved the company. It would turn out to be the thing that killed it first. Chapter 6. The 4-cylinder reckoning. While Norton was being crowned, the reckoning was already on a ship, crossing the world towards it. It made its British debut on the 5th of April 1969 at the Brighton show, the Honda CB750, and the men who gathered round it, the dealers, the journalists, the riders who had spent their lives with British machines, understood almost at once that they were looking at something that changed the terms of the argument entirely. It had 4 cylinders across the frame, humming where a big twin hammered. It had a hydraulic disc brake at the front. It had an electric starter that worked. It was fast, and it was quiet, and it was, above all, effortless. The one quality no British motorcycle of the age could honestly claim. The word for it did not yet quite exist, so the trade reached for a new one. Superbike. The Honda was the first true superbike, and Motorcycle News, the very paper whose readers had crowned the Commando 5 times over, would later describe it, without flinching, as the final nail in the coffin of the ailing British bike industry. Honda would go on to build some 400,000 of that first generation of CB750s. 400,000, against a total Commando production across the model's entire lifetime of around a tenth of that. Set the 2 machines side by side and the trap Norton was standing in becomes horribly plain. The Commando's engine was, at its core, the same parallel twin Burt Hopwood had penned in the late 1940s, pushrods and all, refined and enlarged and coaxed, but never replaced. It leaked oil, because British twins of its lineage leaked oil. It needed regular fettling. The tightening, the tappet setting, the small weekend rituals that the faithful called character and the newcomer called a nuisance. Its electrics were a standing national joke, and to start it, on a cold morning, you performed the old liturgy. Fuel on, tickle the carburetors, find compression, and swing. The Honda owner, meanwhile, pressed a button and rode away. You could watch the shift happen on the showroom floor. A young man who had just started earning, who a decade earlier would have saved for a British twin without a second thought, now stood between the 2 machines and did the sum in his head. On one side, the Commando, faster, more charismatic, with a racing name older than his father. On the other, the Honda, a little cheaper, quieter, and it would start on a frosty morning and never, ever let him down on the way to work. More and more often, the young man chose the machine that would not let him down. And each time he did, he was not just buying a Honda, he was quietly voting on which country's motorcycle industry had a future. None of this was a secret inside Norton. The engineers knew exactly what they were up against. They knew the answer too. The honest answer, the one Rex McCandless had given them back in 1953, the one they had spent 2 decades not acting upon. The answer was a genuinely new engine. Multiple cylinders. Modern design. The thing Honda had and Norton did not. But a new engine costs money that a company must have in the bank before it can begin, and Norton had never, since 1913, truly had money in the bank. Dennis Poor's company was fighting on borrowed capital and thin margins, its flagship selling well, but its whole existence balanced on the edge of the next set of accounts. There was money to develop the machine they had. There was no money, there was never any money, to build the machine they needed. Dr. Stefan Bauer and his engineers understood this better than anyone, and it must have been a peculiar torment. They were good enough to know exactly what the right answer was. They were simply never given the resources to build it. A company that could recruit a man from Rolls-Royce could not fund the one project that man was most qualified to lead. The talent was there. The vision was there. The bank balance was not. And in the end, the bank balance decides. That was the vice Norton lived inside. Brilliant enough to see the future clearly, too poor to reach it. And so, the temptation took shape, quietly, reasonably, the way the most dangerous temptations always do. If Norton could not afford a new engine to answer the Japanese, then it would have to make the old engine do the answering. It would have to find more power inside a design that was already 2 decades old, and already everyone agreed, working near the limit of what it could safely give. There was only one way to do that. You could not add cylinders. You could not start again. You could only take the twin you had and squeeze it harder. They decided to squeeze. Chapter 7. The Combat. In January the 1972, Norton reached into the one place it had left to reach, and it took the decision that the whole story remembers. It built the Combat engine. On paper, the Combat was simply the Commando twin, tuned for more power. In practice, it was the moment a company under commercial siege asked its oldest, most trusted component to do something it had never been designed to do. The compression was raised from 8.9 to 1 up to 10 to 1, achieved not by fitting new high-compression pistons, but by machining some 40,000ths of an inch clean off the cylinder head, so the same pistons now squeezed harder into a smaller space. Into that higher-strung engine went a fierce, high-lift camshaft, long in its timing, lifted more or less directly from the racing program that had produced the yellow production racer. The carburetors grew from 30 to 32 millimeters. The ports were reshaped. The barrels were painted black, so you could tell one at a glance. And it worked, in the sense that mattered to a salesman. The Combat gave 65 horsepower at 6,500 revolutions a minute, up from 58. On paper, on the road test tables where the Japanese machines were beating the British ones, Norton had closed the gap. The trade press was impressed, and the buyers, when the black-barreled engine reached the showrooms, wanted it badly. By the middle of 1972, the Combat was so sought after that Norton was fitting it not to a sporting model or two, but to every commando in the range. Everything about the decision looked, from inside the boardroom, defensible. The company needed the power to survive. The tune came straight from racing, where it had proven itself. The customers were queuing for it. Each of those things was true, and together they marched Norton off a cliff. This is the cruelty of the Combat, and the reason it is worth telling the story straight rather than reaching for villains. Nobody in that decision wanted to build a bad engine. They wanted to save the company. They took a tune that had worked on the racetrack, where engines are stripped and rebuilt between meetings, and they put it into machines that ordinary men would ride to work in the rain for years without ever opening the cases. What survives a weekend at Thruxton in the hands of a works mechanic is not the same thing as what survives a decade of commuting in the hands of a plumber from Preston. Racing reliability and road reliability are different animals, and the difference is measured in exactly the sort of unglamorous, expensive, bottom-end redesign that Norton had no money to fund. So they skipped it, and hoped, because the higher compression and the aggressive cam did not simply add horsepower. They added stress, violent, hammering, cyclical stress, to the one part of the engine that had always been its quiet weakness, the bottom end, the crankshaft and the main bearings that carried it. Norton's twin had never had a truly rigid crank. Under hard use it flexed, a little, as the old ones always had. It had lived with that flex for 20 years because, at 58 horsepower, the flex stayed within what the bearings could bear. The Combat took it past that line. Compounding the trouble, Norton had, only months before, changed the main bearings, moving to a pair of caged roller bearings in place of the earlier arrangement. And now, under the Combat's loads, in a crankcase that had itself been stiffened, the flexing crankshaft began to work against those rollers at an angle they were never meant to take. The hardened edges of the rollers dug into their races. Metal bit into metal, and the bearings began to fail. Not after a long life. Not at the 10 or 15,000 miles where a tired Norton bottom end might once have needed attention. They failed in as little as 4,000 miles, some far sooner. Brand new motorcycles, the most expensive, most powerful, most desirable machines that British industry could sell, the reigning champions, the flags, were destroying themselves almost from the showroom floor. When a main bearing let go, it took the rest with it. Pistons pulled their crowns. Head gaskets blew. A cheap automatic ignition unit jammed or shook itself apart. The magnificent engine ground itself, in the phrase that has followed it down the years, into a large, oily paperweight. Picture what that meant, not in a boardroom, but on a wet motorway in the Midlands. A man who had saved and stretched to buy the best British motorcycle money could buy, the one his father's generation had won TTs on, feeling the deep, sweet pull of it turn suddenly to a knocking, then a grinding, then a seized and silent nothing beneath him. He had done nothing wrong. He had bought the champion, and the champion had betrayed him on the hard shoulder, in the rain. To Norton's real credit, and this is the part of the story that the simple version leaves out, the engineers found the cause and fixed it, and they fixed it fast. Working with the bearing maker Ransom and Marles, they developed a new main bearing, a self-aligning, barrel-shaped roller that could tolerate exactly the crankshaft flex that had been killing the old ones. It let the crank move without letting the rollers bite. They called it the Superblend, and from August 1972, it went into the engines under an urgent service release, retrofitted to the machines already suffering. The compression was quietly wound back down. The black-barreled combat tune was, just as quietly, killed off. And here is the hard, honest heart of the whole documentary, the fact that complicates the title and refuses to let it stand as written. The fix worked. Once a Commando had its Superblend bearings, it was reliable. The mechanical disaster was, in engineering terms, entirely survivable. A bad decision, swiftly understood and swiftly corrected. If the combat had struck a healthy, well-funded company, it would today be a footnote, a difficult year, a lesson learned. But it did not strike a healthy company. It struck a company that had been short of money since before the First World War, that was already losing the technology race to Honda, that could not absorb a flood of warranty claims because it had no reserves to absorb anything at all. Engine after engine came back. Dealers were swamped. The bills mounted at the precise moment Norton could least afford a single extra pound of them, and the disaster exposed something that ran deeper than any one camshaft. The flaws had not been caught before the machines went out. They were discovered by customers, out on the road, one seizure at a time. A company with modern testing and modern quality control would have found the bearing problem on a bench, in a development shop, before a single combat reached a dealer. Norton found it in its customers' engines. The saga laid bare, as one account put it, the archaic and increasingly troubled working practices of a firm that had been making do and mending for decades, that had never had the capital to build the kind of rigorous, unglamorous testing regime that catches a disaster before it ships. The combat did not only break engines, it showed the world how thin the ground beneath Norton had always been. And worse than the money, because money can sometimes be found, was the thing that could not be bought back. Trust. The one thing Norton had always sold. The one thing Pa Norton's records at Brooklands had been built to prove. And Norton was the machine that lasted. That was the promise, 60 years old. And in trying to make its old twin fast enough to fight the Japanese, Norton had broken that promise on its own customers' driveways. The main bearing saga hung round the company's neck, one historian wrote, like a millstone for years. The engineering wound healed in months. The reputational one never really did. Chapter 8. The merger and the sit-in. The combat was Norton's self-inflicted wound. What came next was inflicted by the whole shape of the industry, and by the government that tried to save it. By the middle of 1972, the other great pillar of British motorcycling, the BSA Triumph Group, was in even worse trouble than Norton. It was hemorrhaging money, and a Conservative government, under Edward Heath, decided it could not simply let the last of the British motorcycle industry die on its watch. So it offered a rescue. But the rescue came with a condition. BSA Triumph would be saved only if it merged with Pa's Norton Villiers. In 1973, the two dying giants were bolted together into a single company, Norton Villiers Triumph, NVT. Dennis Pa was made its chairman, handed 4 factories and told to make one healthy business out of 2 failing ones. He looked at the 4 factories the way a financier looks at anything, as numbers. 3 of them, by his reckoning, were losing money, something like £4 million a year between them. Consolidate, close the worst, concentrate production, and perhaps 3 million of that could be saved. It was, on a spreadsheet, sound. It ignored only one thing. Each of those numbers was a town and a workforce and a way of life. On the 14th of September, 1973, Pa drove to the Triumph Works at Meriden in Warwickshire. It was the first time he had ever set foot in the place. He told the workforce that the factory would close, that all 1,700 jobs would go, and then he left, for an urgent meeting in London. The men of Meriden did not accept it. They locked the gates, and with the machinery and the finished motorcycles and the parts all inside, they simply refused to leave. They occupied their own factory, and they held it, not for days, not for weeks, but for something close to 18 months. It became one of the defining industrial confrontations of the decade. When Heath's government fell in early 1974, a Labour government came in, and with it, Tony Benn, the industry secretary, who threw his support and public money behind the men. The Meriden workers formed themselves into a cooperative. They would own the factory. They would run it themselves. The men who led them became names in their own right. Dennis Johnson, who chaired the Action Committee through the long occupation. John Rosamond, who would become chairman of the cooperative itself. Bill Lapworth of the Transport and General Workers' Union in Coventry, marshalling the wider labour movement behind them. And in Parliament, John Tomlinson, the member for Meriden, and the young businessman Geoffrey Robinson, who threw himself into the fight to keep the works alive. This was not a faceless crowd. It was a community, organised, stubborn, and entirely clear about what it was defending. Not just jobs, but the right of a place to go on being itself. The subsidy was granted, then threatened, then withdrawn, then partly restored, as governments changed and the 3-day week darkened the country and the arguments dragged through Whitehall. Ministers came and went. Christopher Chataway, Eric Varley. The names on the letters changed. The men at the gates did not. There is a bitter symmetry to what followed that no scriptwriter would dare invent. The factory Dennis Poor had travelled to Meriden to close, the one he judged the deadest weight of the three. That factory, run by its own workers as a cooperative, outlived Norton Villiers' triumph itself. The men Poor had tried to subtract from the balance sheet kept the gates open and kept building motorcycles for years after the company that had condemned them was gone. It was the one piece of the wreckage that briefly, defiantly, thrived, and it thrived because the people inside it refused the arithmetic that said they should not. And Meriden was not the only sit-in. When redundancy notices went up at Andover, in Hampshire, late in 1973, the commando workers there occupied their factory too. The men who built the Champion refused, as the men at Meriden had refused, to be quietly subtracted. By the end of 1974, for all the mergers and the subsidies and the rescues, NVT had lost more than £3 million. The rescue had welded a dying company to a dying company and called the sum of them a cure. It was not a cure. It was two things falling, roped together, so that neither could reach out a hand to save itself. Chapter 9. The Last Commandos. Even now, even falling, the machine itself got better. That is perhaps the saddest thing of all. Chastened by the combat, Norton did the sensible, humble thing it should have done from the start. In 1973, it enlarged the twin to 828cc, the 850 Commando, and it deliberately tuned the new engine down, favouring easy, unburstable torque over headline horsepower. Norton, one of its own engineers, said plainly, did not want a repeat of the combat problems. Every main bearing was now the reliable type. The company had learned. It had simply learned too late and at too high a price. The last of the line, the 850 Mark III of 1975, was the most complete Commando ever built. It finally had an electric starter, a weak one, admittedly, that struggled to spin the big twin. But there. It had a left-foot gear change to meet new American law, and it had, at last, a proper adjustable Isolastic system, so the rubber mountings no longer needed the old, fiddly ritual of shims. Everything the Commando had ever wanted to be, it now was, and almost nobody was left to buy it. There was one last blaze of the old glory, and it came, as it always had, on the Isle of Man. In 1973, the rider Peter Williams took a radical Norton, the John Player Norton, its frame a stressed skin monocoque of his own design, one of only 4 ever made, and he won the Formula 750 TT, Norton's first Tourist Trophy victory in 12 years. His fastest lap, 107.27 miles an hour, stood as the second quickest in the entire history of the mountain course. His winning race average was 105.47, and he had done it on an air-cooled pushrod twin, a direct descendant of Burt Hopwood's old engine, beating the exotic multi-cylinder machines of the age with sheer handling and courage. Williams was not alone in that last stand. He rode alongside men like Dave Croxford, under the eye of the team manager Frank Perris, a small band of racers and engineers wringing miracles out of an old design, because miracles were the only currency Norton had ever really traded in. Riders like Mick Grant carried the fight to the Japanese on tracks across Britain. They knew, all of them, what was happening to the company behind them. They raced anyway. There is a particular kind of loyalty in giving your best to something you can see is dying, and the Norton race shop had it to the last. It was magnificent. It was also, in its way, unbearable. The Mark winning the greatest race in motorcycling in the very seasons it was being taken apart beneath the men who rode for it. Norton died as it had lived. Winning races, it could no longer afford to enter. Then the money simply ran out. In July 1975, the industry minister Eric Varley called in a £4 million government loan and refused to renew the export credit guarantees that Norton needed to sell its machines abroad. Without them, the company could not trade. NVT went into receivership. Redundancy notices went out across every site. A skeleton concern, NVT Engineering, was set up to finish the motorcycles already half built and to keep the spares flowing. But the great works were closing now, one after another. The Wolverhampton plant, the old Villiers works where the engines had been born, shut its doors in October. Some 1,600 jobs went with it, and in a gesture that still catches the throat, the workers there took the ornamental gates of the old Tong Castle and re-erected them at the former Marston site, as if a factory, like a great house, deserved a proper gate to mark that it had once been somewhere. The very last commandos, around 1,500 of them, were finished by September 1977, assembled from the parts that remained by the last hands that knew how. In 1978, Norton Villiers Triumph was formally liquidated. Over its short, doomed life, it had drawn down government loans and grants of more than £10 million, and it had not been enough, because nothing would have been enough. A small firm, Andover Norton, took on the leftover spares and would, over the years, hand-build a last 30 machines or so from them. And then, the making stopped. After 80 years, the making stopped. But the knowing did not stop. Men who had spent their lives inside the Norton twin refused to let it die with the factory. Specialists like Mick Hemmings, who could build a commando engine the way a luthier builds a violin, kept the skills alive in small workshops long after the great works had fallen silent, rebuilding, restoring, teaching, so that the machines themselves would outlive the company that abandoned them. The corporation was gone. The craft went on, in private hands, out of love. Chapter 10. The name and the ghost. The name survived. The company didn't, and what happened to the name in the decades that followed is a story stranger and, at the end, uglier than anything the engineers could have dreamed. The receivers had held on to one curious asset, an unfinished project to build a rotary-engined motorcycle, a Wankel Norton. It was sold on, and for years small numbers of rotary Nortons were built and slowly sold, a whisper of a great mark kept just barely alive. And then, improbably, that whisper produced one last roar. An engineer named Brian Crichton developed a rotary racer, and in the black and gold colours of an earlier Norton glory, it flew. Steve Spray won a British championship on it in 1989, and in 1992, Steve Hyslop took a screaming rotary Norton round the Isle of Man and won the senior TT. The old mark, one final time, first past the post on the mountain. For a moment, on that most sacred ground, it was as though nothing had ever been lost. But it had. An American enthusiast, Kenny Dreer, poured himself and his backer Oliver Kerm's money into reviving the Commando proper, a beautiful modern 961, and it too ran out of road, halted in 2006. The name drifted, waiting for someone to give it meaning again. What it got instead was a man named Stuart Garner. Garner bought the Norton name in 2008. With money, it would later emerge in court. That was the proceeds of a tax fraud. And over the years that followed, as sole trustee of 3 Norton Company pension schemes, he transferred some £14 million out of them. The schemes held the retirement savings of 227 people, ordinary working people. Among them was a man called Robert Devoir, who had put £120,000 of his own pension into the promise of that famous name. He died in October 2019. He never saw it made right. In January 2020, Norton fell into administration. Concrete blocks were placed across the gates of the factory at Castle Donington, sealing it shut. In 2022, Stuart Garner received a suspended prison sentence and was banned from acting as a company director. The final indignity visited upon Pa Norton's name had not come from Japan, nor from a boardroom spreadsheet, nor from a flawed engine. It had come from a British man looting the pensions of ordinary British workers, using the name that had once stood, above all things, for keeping a promise. And yet, in April 2020, the Norton businesses were bought for £16 million in cash by TVS Motor Company of India. Operations moved to Solihull, a few miles, as it happens, from the Birmingham streets where a sick young toolmaker had opened a workshop 122 years before. The name is Indian-owned now. It has, at last, an owner with the money to honour it. Pa Norton's Mark came home to the Midlands to be looked after by strangers from the other side of the world, and there is something in that which is both a sorrow and a mercy, and it is hard to say which is the larger. Bracebridge Street itself is gone, redeveloped, and little physical evidence remains of the works that once produced the finest racing motorcycles on earth. There is a plaque put up for the company's centenary. There is a memorial run, each year, in the name of the great rider Mike Halewood, that sets off from where the old works stood. And there is one last irony, the sweetest and the strangest of them all. Those combat commandos, the very machines that broke themselves in 4,000 miles, that shattered the trust and flooded the dealers and helped bring the whole edifice down, have long since been rebuilt with their superblend bearings, and they run, now, as they always should have. They are prized, they appreciate, they are cherished above almost any other Norton. The machine that is said to have killed the company has become the machine that keeps its memory most fiercely alive. Chapter 11. What remains? So did one engine destroy Britain's greatest superbike? Stand in the ruins now, with the whole story laid out, and the honest answer is no, not on its own. Not really. The combat engine was a bad decision, taken under real pressure, and it did real and lasting harm. But it did not kill Norton, because the combat was survivable, and the men who built it proved as much within months by curing it. What was not survivable was everything the combat landed upon. Norton was already dying when the black barrels went on. It was dying of an engine 2 decades old that it had never found the money to replace, because the money had never once been there. Not in 1913, when Pa Norton first went broke, and not in 1972 when his Marquet needed to answer Honda and could only reach for the old twin and squeeze. It was dying of a market it had already lost the day the CB 750 landed at Brighton. It was dying of the oldest wound in its body, greatness that always outran its means. The combat did not begin the tragedy. It made the tragedy visible. It took a slow, quiet, decades-long decline and turned it, in a single catastrophic year, into something loud and undeniable and impossible to look away from. It was the accelerant, not the fire. The fire had been smouldering since before Pa Norton died. But do not let the ending be the whole of it, because here is what also remains, and it matters more than the manner of the death. A handful of British engineers, given an obsolete engine, no money, and 11 weeks, built a motorcycle so good that the working riders of the country crowned it, 5 years running, the best in the world. They floated a shaking old twin on rubber and made it smooth. They won the Isle of Man as the company collapsed around them. They built something the whole world wanted, out of very nearly nothing, right to the end. That is the Norton worth remembering. Not the fraud, not the flood of warranty claims, not the concrete blocks across the gates, the forward-canted engine and the deep, clean pull of it through the gears, the featherbed ghost in every frame, the sound of a big British twin doing the one thing it was always meant to do, on an open road, in the hands of someone who loved it. The works in Aston is gone. The ground has been built over. But if you knew where to stand, you could tell them, this is where they made the best in the world, for a while, against all sense and all arithmetic. And for a while, that was enough. For a while, it was everything. Somewhere out there tonight, a combat commando is being warmed up in a cold garage by a man who knows exactly what it once did to its owners, and loves it anyway. Loves it more, perhaps, for having been broken and made whole. The deep twin note settles. The rubber-mounted engine floats, and for the length of a run down an empty road, the whole long tragedy falls away, and there is only the thing itself, fast and smooth and British, and still, after everything, the best a certain kind of person could ever want beneath them. That is what remains, not the ending, the machine, and the ache of knowing how good we once were at building it.